Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sandy Shefkin. I am the American Occupational Therapy, AOTA's Pediatric Program Manager, and I have the honor of introducing this webinar today to you. We're going to be talking about a paradigm shift from caseload to workload and the role of some of our related service providers, and we also call them specialized instructional support personnel, and we'll be talking more about that in a few minutes. This webinar is recorded and will be posted on YouTube afterwards, and we hope that you will share it freely. The webinar will last from 1 to 2:30 Eastern Standard Time, and we hope to give you success stories, talk about workload benefits, and give you some downloadable resources that should be helpful to you. We want to thank you for joining us today, and our deep gratitude to the IDEA Partnership for hosting this and for their leadership. Their website is www.ideapartnership.org and also www.sharedwork.org. There's some wonderful resources there that I hope to share with you today. It's very important to know that we are 3 national organizations that are going to be sharing some information with you today, and we're convening around a topic. Today's topic is workload because it's an area of shared concern. This idea of leading by convening and getting together around topics makes us all stronger because we can learn from one another and have a strong. And that's really the mission of the IDEA Partnership. We hope to get your questions. You can put them in the chat room if you're on the chat line. But if we don't get to your questions today, we hope that you will put your questions on the ASHA website under schools.asha.org. And we hope to collect your questions and use them for further activities down the line. Here's a list of the webinar presenters today. You'll see that there is one presenter represented from one of 3 disciplines or organizations: the American Occupational Therapy Association, the American Physical Therapy Association, and the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association. Each presenter will speak for approximately 20 minutes, and then there will be 15 minutes at the end for questions. I'd like to take a minute before we go through these objectives is to find out who's with us today, because we know that this is an issue, since we have 110 people on the call, that resonates, and we want to know who are the stakeholders and what disciplines do they represent, or what policy, practice, what kind of system upon which they work, because we'll have a better sense of who's on the line and why it is a cross-stakeholdership issue. So Mariola, is it possible? Mariola is our lead from the IDEA Partnership. Would you be able to put up the poll at this point? So hopefully you see in front of you a question: who is on the line? Could you please indicate your role and click which one best represents the discipline or the system upon which you are most affiliated. And we're going to get a sense of the different perspectives. It's very interesting to see. We'll give you just a minute more to click onto the appropriate spot that represents your role. And as you can see, I guess we're just about done, you can see that almost 90% of our participants today are related service providers, or SIPs, but we do have some representatives from an other box, from technical assistance, from higher education, from administration, and from education. And we want to thank you for having this crosswalk, because I think that will make this discussion richer and we'll learn from each other from your questions and comments. So Mariola, thank you very much. And we'll go back to our objectives. Although they're listed here, we as presenters hope that there will be 2 big takeaways from the objectives that you will gain from being on this presentation today. One is the big takeaway is that it's beneficial for us to work together, and that when we convene together at all levels, our work is stronger and leads to better outcomes. And the second big takeaway is to distinguish the differences between a medical caseload and an educational workload, and why these distinctions are so important, and this is really a different way of working. The IDA partnership that's hosting this today is funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, and they offer collaborative work. They represent over 50 national organizations, technical assistance centers, state agencies, and many other stakeholders like family partners and practitioners. Their mission is to bring people together in groups, convening together around topics with the goal of improving lives of youth with disabilities in school and through school towards college, career, and community integration. The IDA partnership talks about 4 key questions that can frame a discussion and to help to develop an action plan. These 4 questions could be applied to any relevant topic, but today we're speaking to these 4 questions in regards to workload. So ask yourself, who cares about the issue of workload? What work do you know is already going underway? What work could unite us? And could you successfully lead on this issue if you don't have your other stakeholders with you? The IDA partnership has developed a blueprint for authentic engagement. This is a downloadable tool from their website. Again, their website is www.ideapartnership.org. The beauty of these tools are that they offer you some ways to start some dialogue in whatever system you work to refer to topics like workload. But you can customize these tools around many different topics. If you go to the IDA Partnership website, you'll find other tools on other specific issues or topics like transition and RTI, but you could apply this information of workload to this leading by convening blueprint. It's important to know that the blueprint that I referred to and that you can get for free and all the tools was developed by the field. So it's vetted by you. The field, the people who actually do the work and care about the work, created the materials that you're hearing about today and that are offered to you as a resource to advance your practices. Now, today's presentation focuses on 3 specific presenters: occupational therapy practitioners, physical therapists, and speech and language pathologists. However, although we only have OTs, PTs, and speech as speakers today, we are only 3 groups of a much larger contingency. The one term that you may be familiar with would be the term related service providers, which is the term utilized under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We are considered related service providers. That's the term that's used to designate us. But under No Child Left Behind, we're referred to as pupil service personnel. That's why there is a new term, specialized instructional support personnel, that is being advocated for as one unifying term. Who are specialized instructional personnel? That is the term that could bridge both the idea of being called a pupil service or a related service. One term representing over 1 million providers. And here's who we are: school counselors, school nurses, school psychologists, school social workers, occupational therapists, physical therapists, art therapists. The list goes on and on. So to capture all aspects of the job description and for consistency's sake, the term SIPs, or Specialized Instructional Personnel, is being advocated for. NASIPs is the National Alliance of Specialized Instructional Personnel. And they have introduced this term, SIPs, in a number of legislative proposals and bills to Congress. The reason, I'm going to go back one slide, the reason that they want to focus on this term and to advocate for SIPs is to make sure that we encompass the range of activities that SIPs engage in, addressing both mental and physical health in schools, and the broad scope of our practices for prevention, promotion, and intervention for better school outcomes for all students with or without disabilities. This range of activities aligns very much with workload, and you'll be hearing more about this as we start to take a deeper look and hear more from our other speakers about workload, what it means to SIPs, and what it means to all of us to address school needs. So I'm going to turn over the conversation to my colleague, Deborah Dixon from ASHA, who will lead us onto more discovery. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you, Sandy. I'm glad to be here with you, and I'm so pleased to see so many people in our audience. So what is caseload? It's probably the term most of us are very familiar with because it's the process used by most administrators to assign staff. And it refers to the number of students with IEPs or IFSPs who are receiving services. So most of us say we have a caseload of 20, 30, 40, and hopefully not much beyond that, but we know that's what occurs. There are concerns about caseload because it stems from a medical approach, and we're actually working in an educational model. It certainly does not account for the significant expanded roles and responsibilities necessary to help students achieve positive outcomes. We feel that it can lead to compromised quality of service. We know that it contributes to morale and certainly makes paperwork, already a burdensome activity, even more burdensome. We know that with each child that you work with, you have lots of responsibilities. You have meetings, you have report writing, you have consultation and collaboration, and if you're assigned purely by a caseload, that does not account for those kinds of activities, and we'll talk about that a little more as we go along. A quote from the OT group, a simple caseload does not recognize the potential occupational therapy contribution to Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004, participation focus, or its mandate that services support access and progress in the general education curriculum or natural environments. So it really is an antiquated thought process that makes us put a square peg into a round hole, so to speak, as we approach service delivery in this century. So what is workload? It's the term we're going to be using a lot, and it refers to a continuum of activities provided to and on behalf of students. So it's the direct as well as the indirect services. And that on behalf of is really an important aspect of it. So they're services that support the student's educational program, that ensure compliance with IDEA, NCLB, state and local mandates, as well as just to fulfill the role that all of us as professionals have in working in the school setting. So it includes a number of different kinds of responsibilities. Certainly direct service. So when you're sitting in the classroom or across the table or in the workout room, that's part of workload. Travel between work assignments for those of us that are itinerant and going from place to place. Documentation. We all know that that takes up a significant amount of our time, yet how many of us have a slot allotted on our schedule for that kind of work? IEP and team meetings, other kinds of meetings that we participate in. consultation and collaboration with educational staff as well as families. Assistive technology responsibilities, so programming, choosing, trialing assistive technology. Certainly professional development. We know the IEP document has a line that asks for what supports need to be in place for the service providers. Often professional development is one of those supports. Planning and research. We're all called upon to do evidence-based practices, and so we need that time to plan and to search and look at the evidence that would drive our practices. Behavior support activities. We know it takes a village to raise children and educate children, so everybody at the table that has a role to play in the education of all children or a particular child need to come together, need to join together to make sure they're on the same page with behavior support, with planning, with supporting one another's goals, both academic goals as well as all the SIPs goals. And certainly multi-tiered systems of support or response to intervention. All of us can play a very important role in that whole process in the prevention of taking children from general ed to a special education service delivery. There's a lot we can do within that general environment as we work together to support students, to determine if indeed the student needs that very specialized training and support that is required by special education, or are there supports that we can embed in the classroom. So all of those activities are activities that are considered to be part of the workload. So as we determine workload, we want to think about all of these things. So as we approach a workload, what does that mean? Well, it certainly varies from place to place, and calculations are done a little differently, but it looks at a complex number of factors and includes looking at the time demands that include all the things we've just spoken about, meetings, paperwork, travel. Here's kind of a visual display of looking at all of the aspects of our work that we need to consider as we are looking at our workload and ascribing what is all included in our workload. And it's divided, as you can see, into 4 different quadrants: direct services to students, indirect services supporting students, indirect activities in the least restrictive environment and general education, as well as compliance activities. And it really behooves us all to make sure that anybody that we're working with values all 4 of these quadrants as much as we value the direct services to students. You know, often I've been in IEP meetings and we talk with parents about the collaborative efforts, the programming, the assistive devices, the observing, all those kinds of indirect services or compliance, and often those aren't valued as much or considered as supportive of the students as we think they should be. So we as providers need to make the case as to why those indirect activities are so important from the very beginning, so parents and other team members understand what we're doing and all the aspects that contribute to student success. So how is workload beneficial? Well, we've already talked about our roles have expanded. You know, I've worked in this field, I'm a speech-language pathologist, for more years than I care to admit. I did ride a dinosaur to my first practice setting, but, you know, and we know that our responsibilities have expanded dramatically since many of us older ones began here. It isn't just providing service, but we know interprofessional practice and training is a real critical part of what we do. Collaborating and working with parents, doing all the things that surround a student to make them successful, thinking about accommodations and adaptations, developing specialized materials, all those kinds of things, and certainly our role in RTI as well as other kinds of teams. We certainly know that we have concerns about the quality of service and the ethical considerations that we need to adhere to produce positive student outcomes. It's very difficult to adhere to those ethics and to provide quality services when you're overwhelmed with all the things that you need to do, and you don't have time to do all the things that contribute to successful student experiences. We certainly know that it's much more beneficial if we develop staffing models that meet the needs of the students, the school, as well as the practitioners. So a friend of mine works in Virginia and happened to work with a special education or a general ed classroom teacher. And one year she could only work with one of those classrooms. The teacher had 3 classrooms. She worked with one. It was integrated. They developed a schedule that allowed them lots of collaboration and time together. They really worked as a very positive team. The other class, that wasn't able to be done in that particular year for a number of reasons, scheduling and some other kinds of things. That was a wonderful opportunity, though, for those 2 professionals to go back and look, how did that impact student success? If what they found, it was not a super scientific study, but they looked at students in Class A with the collaborative efforts in a workload context, and the other group looking at a standard delivery model. And they found that 90% of the students in that collaborative model made much greater gains on their state testing outcomes than did the other group. And so, although it's not a standardized official study, that spoke volumes to us about how important it is that we're all integrated and working together. And certainly, you can't do that with a pure caseload assignment. Benefits. Certainly, it encourages collaboration, not only with the staff, but also with the family. It complies with IDEA, certainly providing appropriate services. And I think those of us that have practiced for a while under a caseload model are concerned when you're seeing so many students that you're able to develop appropriate services. It correlates with increased job satisfaction. It supports early identification of struggling students. It engages all stakeholders in student success, and it certainly aligns with district policy goals supporting students' health and wellness. Again, another example of the correlating to increased job satisfaction. There was a very large school district in the western part of our country who had great difficulty recruiting SLPs as well as retaining them. One of those factors was caseload. They went to a workload model, and there are many models. They happened to choose what was called a 3-1 model, and we'll talk about that a little later. They found, and when they started this, they had something like 50 open positions in the speech department. Their turnover rate annually was 30 to 40%. After moving to a workload context, they had 3 or 4 open positions, and they had a turnover rate less than 5 or 6%. So it really speaks to increasing job satisfaction and making the work environment a positive one for all of the people that work there. And it does so because it makes us better able to provide quality services and support student success. So, workload helps to answer questions from multiple stakeholders. So, for example, we as specialized instructional support personnel want to know, how can I provide those ethical services? How can I be a good team member? And how can I pick up yet another student under the current arrangement? The team concerns. It addresses their concerns about the need for collaboration, about everyone being a true team member of the IEP team. So not only are they at the table, but prior to that, they've all discussed things and brought information, analyzed student needs, etc. It certainly provides assistance for students with challenging issues. If you have a workload model, part of your workload assignment gives considerations for your work that needs to be done in the general ed environment, whether it's an RTI or collaboration or a screening or work within the classroom. Administrator concerns. How much service is required to promote student outcomes? That certainly is a big question. What do we do when an SLP can't manage another student, and how many staff members are needed to service our students successfully? There are certainly benefits for all stakeholders. holders, Building administrators know that they will have better engagement of SISPs in supporting college and career readiness. We know that special ed administrators can view this as a means for reducing due process and requests for mediation. We know that parents are engaged in this process because it provides them an opportunity to more fully engage with the professionals in all of the child's programming considerations. Classroom teachers, as we've said, are encouraged with the opportunity to collaborate with SISPs and to improve student outcomes. And for those of us that are SISPs, it ensures the opportunity to truly provide that continuum of services and to collaborate with all team members. We know that we can't work in vacuums or silos, that we need to be integrated and work with one another to support one another's goals, and yet we also need to create the environment so that that can truly happen. We know that there are advantages for the school community. It does allow professionals to support students when their concerns arise regarding participation in multiple learning environments. So if you have a good workload environment where all professionals have access to collaboration and communication, you all know what's happening in each child's life. You're able to understand the behavior management strategies, the goals, the success, the ways that a child does respond to instruction. Those are all really important components of supporting students and making sure they're successful. Again, we've talked a lot about that collaboration being so critical to achieving positive student outcomes. We know that also it allows us to incorporate all the different services and therapies into the school community, providing better assessment and provision of system-wide support for the desired school outcome. We all, working with that child, need to be assured of all the goals and all the needs of that child. And you can't do that, again, when you're in silos or when you're running in the building for catching student 1 3 minutes before you get there and running out of the building just after to get to your next client. It certainly improves the retention and recruitment of specialized professionals. Think back on the Western School District that I mentioned a few moments ago. And it does increase the ability and opportunity to provide a free and emphasize appropriate educational program. That appropriate one is often of concern with very high caseloads. There are advantages for families. It strengthens communication and understanding between families and the service providers. It gives us a greater opportunity to talk with families about strategies to use in the home and the community. It helps families and gives us an opportunity to work with them to ensure they can promote progress and support the child's goals as well as the transitions throughout his or her school career. And certainly provides a greater understanding of their child's strengths, needs, and their response to different kinds of instruction. And lastly, what do we see as the advantages for specialized instructional support personnel or related service providers? This process recognizes the complexity of our roles in best practices scenarios. A caseload can't possibly do that when all that you're looking at when you're assigning is how many student bodies need to be served. Instead, looking at an example, for example, you may have 20 students on a caseload, and that may seem relatively small. But if they're all students that have multiple disabilities, work with assistive technology, need lots of collaboration and feedback to the home and to the school, that can be a very high, quote, caseload. The same as if you have 40 students, but they're all mildly involved, don't have as many other kinds of considerations that different professionals need to collaborate about. Again, so that's why the caseload isn't a number, or shouldn't be a number, because those numbers don't really represent the complexity. We certainly know that the other advantage is it promotes equity and access for all students, so that it provides those opportunities to ensure a student is getting the appropriate services, both within an RTI type service delivery or within an IEP delivery. It expands the role, or I might correct this, recognizes the roles of SISPs beyond the direct service delivery. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we need to educate one another how important all the aspects of service delivery are for student success. So not only the time you sit in front of the student, but all the things that you do on behalf of that student. It certainly improves job satisfaction and supporting retention and recruitment efforts. Now I'm going to turn this over to Jody Williams, and she's going to continue our discussion.
Hi everyone, my name is Jody Williams. I'm a school system occupational therapy manager. I'm delighted to be here with you today. This is a topic for which I have a great deal of passion. And we're going to start off talking a little bit about the connection between SISP shortages and workload. There's been a lot of studies done in this area. They're finding that there's a growing shortage of qualified school-employed SISPs, in many cases a critical shortage. And this is throughout the country. The National Coalition of Personnel Shortages in Special Ed and Related Services found that this impedes the ability of students with disabilities to reach their full academic potential. One of the primary reasons for the shortage is recruitment and retention challenges, and this includes poor working conditions, which includes unreasonable caseloads. Hold on just a second. I think people are having a hard time hearing me. We're trying to see what we can do to address this issue. Let me know if you can better. Keep talking, and we'll see if we can fix this. We're having a few technology problems. Okay, is this any better? Can someone let me know if you can hear me better now? Okay, all right, we're going to keep going then. In case you didn't hear me, I'll repeat what I had said. The National Coalition on Personnel Shortages in Special Ed and Related Services recognize that there's a critical shortage of specialized instructional support personnel in all regions of the country, and this shortage impedes the ability of students with disabilities to reach their full academic potential. The primary reason for the shortage is recruitment and retention challenges, and which includes poor working conditions, and part of that is having an unmanageable caseload. There was also a 2011 Personnel Improvement Center practice brief, which was written by the National Center to Improve Recruitment and Retention of Qualified Personnel for Children with Disabilities, and they reported, quote, in order to address the sometimes excessively large caseloads of OTs, PTs, and SLPs, related service providers and related service provider associations are advocating for a conversion from a caseload to a workload model. So this is one of the ways of addressing that issue of shortages and to hopefully remediate that. The role in the last 10 to 15 years of SISPs has broadened. And it's gone beyond an individual one-to-one work with a student in the classroom to now include initiatives that are classroom-wide, building-wide, and district-wide. Some of these include the items that we have listed here: universal design for learning, positive behavioral intervention supports, response to intervention, and Common Core state standards, because we want to be able to support all students in the least restrictive environment and also to facilitate student participation in the general ed curriculum. We see that our expertise is needed beyond the special ed classroom and to support the needs of all students, including those in general education and the least restrictive environment. These expanded roles speak to the need for a continuum of services, and a workload approach recognizes and helps SISPs to meet all of these demands. So when we talk about transitioning to workload, a question that logically comes up is, what does a workload approach look like in practice? With a workload approach, we would continue to see SISPs working directly with children and collaborating with teachers and parents. So nothing in that realm would change. We would continue to do what we've always done. However, we would also see SISPs providing in-services to educators and parents. We would see them attending professional development, engaging in mentoring of SISPs who are new to school-based practice. researching strategies for evidence-based practices, participating in school improvement planning, and contributing their expertise in district-wide and statewide meetings. Oftentimes these statewide and district-wide meetings are attended by educators, and SISPs don't have a seat at that table. And without our participation, they don't have that perspective that we bring that is unique to the school system. And we see children in a slightly different way than educators do. It's beneficial for the children for us to have a voice in those discussions. So what we don't want to see is SISPs that are so encumbered by an outdated caseload approach that he or she can only skim the surface of all we are capable of achieving in school-based practice. Rather than being buried under a caseload based solely on the number of students with IEPs, all tasks that encompass a SISP's realm of responsibilities would be allotted for within his or her workload. It's also important to note that that workload not only considers all of the tasks, but it recognizes the time demands required for the completion of them. Transitioning from caseload to workload begins with a thorough and well-documented workload analysis. The first step of this analysis is to consider all of the different activities you as a service provider engage in to meet your students' identified needs. Next, you'll need to think of the mandates that are issued by your education agency. This would include administrative tasks like Medicaid billing or some of the reports you need to write. You engage in evidence-based practices when you research the characteristics of an unfamiliar syndrome, search journal articles for effective strategies, or consult with a more experienced practitioner about a student whose needs have you puzzled. This final step of the process takes these activities into consideration, and they provide you with the broad areas that you'll need for your workload analysis. So once you have all aspects of your work divided into these broad areas, you can then begin to divide them into discrete categories. In the district in which I work, the categories include direct student service, indirect student service, meetings, IEP documentation, which includes service capture, quarterly progress notes, program documentation, which are things like the administrative reports and Medicaid billing, supervision and mentoring, professional development, travel, pre-intervening services, which is also called RTI in many places. And we also have a category for other, and in that other category, we ask people to note what activities they were engaged in, because if enough people are doing this, we need to create a new category with that information. We then create a time study, and therapists track their activities in 15-minute increments over a period of time to see the average percentage of the time spent in each of these categories. Now, the more practitioners that participate in the study and the more periods tracked result in increased confidence in your workload analysis. Sue Cesary, who's going to speak in a few minutes, and I used to work together, and we developed a time study, and we'll share a link for how to get to that in a few minutes. But when we did this back 2004 time period, we asked all of the OTs that I supervised and all of the PTs that she supervised to track their time for a 1-week period every month for an entire school year. It was a lot of work, but we worked with a phenomenal group of OTs and PTs. They were very willing to help us with this because they saw the benefits of it, they saw where we were trying to go with it, and they provided us with lots of data that then we could use to create a workload formula for staffing. It's also important to note that results for these time studies will be very individualized and may be different based on the location, the needs of the students served, and the discipline. However, over time, trends will begin to emerge. One of the areas that we see a lot of variation in is travel. If you work in a very rural section where the schools are very far apart, you're going to have a lot more time on the road and a lot more time in travel than someone like me who works in a suburban area. Also, if you work in an urban area where the schools are relatively close together, but you have a lot of traffic to deal with, you'll also have a lot of travel time. So we can't do a one-size-fits-all. It's going to be highly individualized based on your district, and you need to collect the information for how your district does things in order to come up with a workload formula. But we have noticed when we look at the trends that it appears overall that for both OTs and PTs, they spend about 50% of their time in services to and on behalf of students. So that's the direct and the indirect services. They also spend 20% of their time in documentation. So if you think about it, if you're a full-time employee working 5 days a week, one entire day of that week is spent in documentation. If you haven't allotted for that time and you aren't given the time to do that, then you're going to be in trouble. So we want to help people to realize all of those tasks are important, they're all meaningful, we have to engage in those, and you need to be given the time in order to do that. We also want to show you a little bit about exactly what IDEA says about indirect services. This is an exact quote from the law, and you'll see in that final statement, the final sentence, it says to be provided to the child or on behalf of the child. It doesn't say anything about direct and indirect services. Those are terms that we frequently use on our own, but that's not what is said in IDEA. Both types of services are important, and both need to be considered when you're putting staffing formulas together. Those of us who have worked with children and who have worked with school systems for a long time know that that indirect service can be just as important, if not more important, than the direct service, because those environmental modifications that we make, the consultation that we provide to the student's teacher, makes changes for that child every hour of the day that he or she is in school, and not just the brief period of time that we may be with them. So we need to consider that indirect or service on behalf of the child as well when we're calculating caseloads or workloads. Sue and I, when we started working on this, went back through the literature to find what kind of work had already been done. We found a previous work done by Winnie Dunn in the year 2000. She advocated for a workload approach for school system employees at that time, and she divided the work OTs do in 3 different clusters. Her clusters were service provision tasks, which includes time spent with students, time needed to prepare for interventions, and the time needed to document those services. She also had associated service provision tasks for things like team meetings and assessments. And then she had non-service provision tasks, which included lunch, travel, supervisory responsibilities, and mentoring. Now, this was some years before Sue and I did our workload analysis, but we came up with about 70% of time in direct, indirect service and documentation. And Winnie Dunn came up with a figure that was just within a couple of percentage points of what we had done. So we felt pretty confident that what we were finding was what other places would find as well. The SLPs divide their activities into 4 different clusters. Deb Dixon talked about this a little bit previously, but their clusters are direct services to students, indirect activities, indirect services, and activities that support compliance. And within each of those sections, you can read more information about exactly what that encompasses. But even though they come at it from a slightly different perspective, overall the issues are the same. We're tackling the same kinds of tasks and responsibilities, and so this gives them the 4 broad ranges that then they can break down into categories in order to do a time study. Asha did a lot of work with workload early on, and when Sue and I were researching what information was available out there, much of the work that we started with was based on the work of Asha. Special education teachers are also working on this issue. School systems such as Oklahoma have set limits on the number of students for special education classrooms. Illinois is a bit more forward-thinking in their approach to it. They're looking at the percentage of time children spend in special education to determine class size. For example, they find that a student less than or equal than 20% of their time in special ed can have a limit of 15 students in the classroom. Students who have more intensive needs, for example, those needing greater than or equal to 60% of the time, a special education teacher can only have 8 of those students in the classroom. So again, they're looking at that intensity of need and how much time is required when they're setting up what the classrooms can look like for those teachers. The case is a little different for SISPs, who are typically assigned to school buildings in the fall, and this doesn't account for any changes involving the intensity of services that may occur in the student population during the course of a school year. And once the school year has started, school systems sometimes lack methods to address these changes, and SISPs are faced with unmet student needs and some of the ethical challenges that Deb Dixon talked about. These are among the working conditions that result in poor retention of OTs, PTs, and SLPs in the school system, and this is what we're trying to avoid in part by going to a workload perspective. School psychologists are another group within the SISP umbrella, and they're also tackling this issue. School psychologists historically have been assigned caseloads based on ratios. For example, 1 school psychologist per 1,000 students. But these professionals are also recognizing the shortcomings of being assigned caseloads based purely on numbers of students. Groups of school psychologists in many school districts are advocating for a workload approach. And you can see this quote is saying that using a caseload approach and simply counting kids doesn't take into account all of the responsibilities that they have as school psychologists, and that the indirect activities are equally as important. So this is another group that's looking at the caseload versus workload issue. The time study that I mentioned, I want to give you instructions as to how to find that. We do have a link posted on the AOTA website. And if you go to that site, it's www.aota.org. From that site, if you type the word workload in the search box, the first match that comes up says caseload to workload, AOTA. And if you click on that, there's a list of 3 featured areas. We're at the very bottom. There's a link. You can click on that, and that will take you directly to the time study that Sue and I have developed. We'll type in that information. I think Sue is doing it as I speak, so that we can share that information with everyone. You're welcome to download it and use it. Like I said, your categories may need to be tweaked a little bit, but it will give you a way to, a starting point to track what you're doing as a school-based therapist. It will automatically calculate your percentage of time in each of the activities, and the more you join forces with other people, the more data points you can collect with this information, the more confident you can be with the accuracy of what your workload is composed of, and then you can take it to administrators and advocate for a workload approach for caseload decisions. I'm going to now turn it over to Sue Cesare, who is going to, I think, wrap this up a little bit for us.
Hi, everybody. This is Sue. I'm also very happy to be here, and workload is one of my passions. If I get on a soapbox, I'll apologize in advance, but I feel Jody and I have worked very hard on this topic collectively and in our own separate districts to share with administrators just the importance of looking at staffing for related service providers in this way, so we do meet student needs and we support ethical and best practices. What I wanted to share with you initially was in 2009 in Baltimore, the American Physical Therapy Association and Section on Pediatrics sponsored a concentrated education series on schools, and I had the opportunity to present a study that was done on workload through the section and through the school state. And the data came from across the country. We didn't have equal representation from the different areas of the country, but we did have representation from all areas of the country in a variety of numbers, with the heaviest input coming from the Mid-Atlantic Northeast. But to just give you a little data and to support exactly what Jody was saying in terms of numbers, we found that collectively student services and documentation for one work week using the tool that we're sharing with you, which was an earlier version of the tool. The tool has evolved over time. The tool that Jody has given you the information for actually has a page on it that will collect after work hours, because we know, given the enormity of your roles in schools and the documentation demands, most people are working after their work hours, and so we have committed to trying to capture some of that information. As Jody talked about, strength in numbers, and that's not only strength in numbers, the number of therapists completing a time study, but also strength in data to be able to share with your administrators. So we did find for the PTs that participated in our study that student service and documentation for one work was 63% of one full-time equivalent. Not quite what OT and the data that came from the AOTA was, but similar. And that 46% was spent in direct and indirect, with 17% of an FTE spent in documentation tasks. I will share with you that in the district where I work, which is a large, diverse district in the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area, we've been collecting this information using this tool since I've come on board there, which is 8 years. We have an electronic IP system. I think people are sometimes under the impression that technology makes their work easier, but that's not always the case, and I'm sure there are people online who would absolutely agree with that. You have to log on, you've got to find a signal, and the list goes on. But what we did find is that 20%, as a general rule, of a therapist's time is spent documenting, and that varies depending upon the time of the year, depends on how many reevaluations you have, but the bottom line is it is a huge chunk that must be recognized. Our licensure demands documentation. We use it to make decisions about our students and the interventions that we use. And for those folks who are not licensed, I think it's sometimes a struggle to understand that component of what we do. And as a result of that, it is imperative that we be able to speak to this whole concept of workload very articulately so we can get people to understand. For anyone who has heard me speak at any other school-based conferences, it's in your hands. We have to advocate for ourselves. We're generally a very small number in whatever school district you work in. So the more you can get comfortable with the terminology of workload and the components of workload, the better the case you will have when you go and you sit down and you talk with your administrators or whomever your direct report is. So from there, I'm going to move on. So that was our study. And so this is often what I see when I go into people's offices. I don't know about the offices that you work in, but as the year winds down and people are scrambling to get their documentation done, I think this is not an unusual scene. Could be male or female. So I'm going to speak about ongoing efforts in advocacy. As I said, and as Jody shared, this is really a passion of ours to get the word out about workload and help therapists develop their own time studies and look at their own data, follow along with sort of our process, be able to identify their practice trends, and then to be able to speak to it with confidence when they meet with administrators and have data to support what it is that they're saying. It's in the numbers, and I think people recognize that. We're in the world of accountability, and it's those numbers that administrators look to and make decisions about, and we're hopeful that at the conclusion of this, and certainly any questions that you might have, that you're able to pull this together and start to collect your information and then move forward. So in terms of the national level, clearly here we are, AOTA, and ASHA, APTA and ASHA. We've come together through the IDA partnership, which has more than 50 coordinating organizations, to be able to look to this issue and look at maybe creating some new administrative standards. I had the very good fortune of participating in a government accounting office focus group that spoke to workload burden, specifically paperwork burden and special education, but you've got to get the word out. It is incumbent upon us to do that as professionals. joining your national organization, becoming involved in the special interest groups for schools and ASHA and AOTA and APTA, banding together, getting comfortable with the terminology and being able to speak to that. And then working together with those organizations to identify what those issues are. Help your colleagues, help to promote workload and why it is best practice. Get comfortable with the literature and some of the resources which we will provide as part of this webinar for you. At the state level, you can also work collaboratively with your state policymakers. So let me share a story with you about Jody's and my experience here in Maryland. In Maryland, we are very fortunate to have an extremely active and well-respected steering committee for occupational and physical therapy that's under the umbrella of the Maryland State Department of Education. And over time, we wrote a guide to practice. And for any of you who are in AOTA or APTA, you've probably been able to gain access to the Maryland Guide to Practice. It's a document we're very, very proud of, and it's just been revised and will be reposted quickly. However, what we did do is we did address workload, and we document what workload is and why it is best practice, and it is available to any school-based therapist in the state of Maryland. And we did that at the state. And so again, I think that's something that at your state level, getting involved with your state chapter or your state Department of Education, make an appointment and speak to someone about this. It is a national and state level concern. So at the local level, Jody shared with you our experience. When we started this work way back in the 2000s, what happened was our therapists were being asked now to go into the community. So we had preschool-age children who were receiving services in preschools out into the community, which is way different from being serviced in a school where you have numerous children. And so we did the logical thing. We kind of looked at the numbers of kids everybody had based on the hours that they were working, not thinking about traveling to those facilities, consulting with teachers who were not public school teachers, and they were also still working in those buildings. And so what was happening was we were hearing rumblings about people kind of quote-unquote drowning. And so we started to problem solve, how are we going to address this? All of you know that the last thing you usually do is say, I can't take another student. If you're at Johnny Appleseed Elementary School and you get 3 new kids every month on top of your existing caseload, that's your building. That's your responsibility. We felt compelled to find a way for therapists to not have to come to us and say, I can't take another student. We wanted to be able to say to them, you can't take another student. It's time for you to get some help. Let me see what we can do for you. And so by doing the workload analysis, using the tool that we shared for you, we started to look at practice trends, and then we also started to look at IEP content and look to start to develop some relationships between the practice trends and then what were actually written on an IEP. And that helped us to develop our workload formula, which Jody talked to in a few slides previous to this one. So when we did the workload analysis and we created the tool, we brainstormed about all the different activities as been shared in previous presenters. What are the things that we do? And that has somewhat evolved over time. Jody and Deb and Sandy both spoke to RTI. That came with new legislation, which was almost before we started this work. And that has really impacted, especially our OT colleagues, because they get called into some more of those academic pencil paper tasks than a PT might. Our speech language pathology colleagues also may be way more involved with the PBIS and the RTI. But in the end, that time has to be accounted for. And over time, what we've seen is a change in that responsibility and the time element that had to be allotted for that consideration. I just had this discussion with my colleague in my district, and it is a force to be reckoned with for our SLP and our OT colleagues. That number is increasing, and of course they're trying to keep children out of special education, and this is how they're doing it. but it still requires our expertise. And so with that not being linked to IEP numbers, it becomes challenging, and we have to be able to advocate for that. So again, just sort of putting that out there, and why collecting this information in a systematic way so you can analyze it and share it and discuss it is really, really important. Our colleagues in North Carolina, Lori Ray, Lauren Holleran, and I believe it's Perry Flynn, who's an SLP, they've got a great system that they've developed for their practitioners down in North Carolina. I was hoping that they might be available today. They're hugely knowledgeable and great proponents of this whole approach to assigning students. I believe you can access their materials if you Google the Department of Public Instruction in North Carolina. But as a side note, Lori Ray is a dear friend and colleague of mine, and she had shared this with me at one time, and I had shared with her some of the work that Jody and I had done. So Jody and I took the time to look at their caseload model, workload model rather, and see how it's sort of shored up to our formula. And interestingly, we were within a tenth of each other. So after we got done high-fiving each other, Lori and I just said, you know, there is so much merit to developing these formulas in order to be able to ethically and comprehensively give students what they need and what therapists need. So anyway, here's a couple comments from our colleagues down there in North Carolina. And you can read this about analyzing their workload using the IEPs. So they looked at it per program and numbers in specific buildings and their intensity of need. But you can see just from these quotes how the impact of looking at workload has really facilitated the professionalism of their therapists down there in North Carolina. And they've given them the tools for the therapists out in the state to be able to speak to their districts about this very topic. So thank you, Lori, Lauren, and Perry. In Ohio, they have some regulatory language that has been shared with us about workload and workload considerations for the SISPs. And I believe you can Google that. I don't know if we have the link to the regulations handy, and if we can find it, maybe we can type it in, or we can answer it as a question. They do address workload in their regulations, and they talk about how it encompasses so many different activities that the SISPs do, and that consideration must be given, and sort of gives the reasons why it must be given. As you scroll down in their regulatory language, however, they do maximum numbers. And I just wanted to throw that out there. So we've tried to get away from maximum numbers as we've looked at this topic, because no two children are the same, and maximum numbers sort of doesn't support my concept of what I would consider a workload to be. But again, every state is an individual, every district is individual, and in Ohio, this is something that their therapists pull together and put into their regulatory language, and I admire them for that. And I think they're successful in making sure that their therapists are getting the time that they need in order to meet all the needs of students, whether they receive special education and related services or not.
If I can just jump in for a second, excuse me, Sue. We do have a list of references at the end of this PowerPoint, and when this is uploaded and available to you, we have the links included for the state of Ohio and North Carolina, so you will be able to access their information on the reference page.
And I really encourage people to do that. You know, Jody and I found a way for it to work for us, but our school district is not like your school district. Explore what's out there and sit down with your colleagues and have a conversation about what you think might work, and go forward from there. Someone has just shared that our North Carolina link isn't correct. We will see if we can correct that for you while we're still online. We still have about a half an hour to go. And so we apologize for that, but we will work to fix that for you. In Texas, and I believe my colleague here, Deb Dixon, talked about our Western state friends, but they in the Houston School District noticed a real change in their vacancy numbers once they went to a workload model that was much more supportive of their SLPs. And it helped them, and this goes back to what we spoke to before, of how it is very supportive, really, of student outcomes, and they're being able to benefit from the implementation of Common Core, being able to benefit from the inclusion of Universal Design for Learning language, and so having that broader approach to your day-to-day work facilitates the engagement of all of those things that are out there now that somehow most everyone thinks that we have a responsibility for taking care of. So there is a link, I believe, or a reference to Texas if you wanted to read a little bit more about what they did or what their outcomes were once they implemented this workload approach. So we have written a joint document. If you're members of the 3 professional organizations, it has been posted. We're providing the links here for you. And I encourage you to read it, get comfortable with the language, understand what it means, and sit down with your colleagues and go over it, and then start your conversation about how you might want to start the conversation about workload. Is it that we want to try the tool that's been made available to us through this webinar? Are the categories similar to the categories that we would consider to be those workload categories, or is it a little different for us? Try it for a little while. Ask your therapist to just do it for a week between now and May, and at the end of the year lunch, talk about the data. How much time do you spend traveling? How much time do you spend in those services on behalf of students? How much time do you spend in meetings? How much time do you spend documenting? I will tell you again that that number is huge. And consistently in my district, it has been at least 20%. It rarely drops below that. It often will go above that. I see that our colleagues in Texas don't use Common Core, so thank you for clarifying that for us, Jean. I know in Maryland we use Common Core. We're getting ready to move to Park, and those accommodations now are taking up a lot of our professionals' time.
There's a state curriculum regardless of whether
it's Common Core. Okay. And there is a state curriculum regardless of where you are. So, so Peggy just asked us the question, but the misperception of special ed administrators that you must have a goal. So now we're actually getting a little more nitty-gritty into how you manage your practice. If you're interested, I can share with you what we do here in Maryland, but what we do not have to have goals because we have students that we are supporting just through services. We don't feel like they might not develop a skill or even refine a skill, but they still need support for health reasons, for repositioning, for equipment management, and those kinds of things. Supplementary aids and services, which is where a lot of this is captured, is a great place to put some of that, but that does require time. The challenge in all of this workload discussion truly is that that time does not have to be specifically written into an IEP, the duration of that session. Just the frequency has to be. And so that poses problems for us, I know, here in Maryland, and we're looking to try to solve that with, looking at our workload formula. If we have students, it does impact workload because of the documentation that's involved, whether if you're a PT or an OT or an SLP who has a student. The clinical programs do require the clinical instructors or the field people. What do the OTs call your people? Field managers when you have field students? Is it just a clinical instructor?
Yes, clinical instructor.
It requires paperwork, it requires meeting, it requires a lot of time. And so we do have an element on our time study that captures that. And so if you take a look at the time study, you'll see that, and it might be something to have your clinical instructors just track for you. And that could help make a decision whether or not you really do have the time to support having a student. I don't know what else to say to that, but anyway, that's a consideration, is to use the time study, Christine, to see how much time it really is taking. Sarah Billings just wrote in about workload approach retaining SLPs. I think Deb and Jody did share that there's some positive feedback about using workload and retaining specifically SLPs. My dear friend and colleague Jody has used her workload to support the hiring of more people. And where I am, we have used our workload to justify maintaining the number of people or actually bringing agency people in, because we have the data to support the need. You've got to have that data to support the need, because otherwise you're just saying you need more people and they're like, okay, ladies and gentlemen, is this the usual, we have too much work and not enough bodies? Now you can prove it.
And it is interesting that we were able to hire more people, but more importantly, we didn't lose as many. So we didn't have to hire new people year after year after year, and in the long run, that saved the district a lot of money, I believe, because they didn't have to recruit and train someone brand new every single school year. We were able to keep the people that we had because their job satisfaction was greater.
And I think if you're doing a comprehensive work study, a workload analysis, I can't imagine a scenario where you'd want to cut back on staff based on the full range of roles and responsibilities that you have to adhere to. So I am not aware of any places where this workload analysis has resulted in fewer SLPs. It can result in more, but there are a number of ways to accommodate all the roles and responsibilities. And I know administrators are often concerned about finding the funding to hire more staff. So an alternative to that many SLPs use is a 3-1 service delivery model. In that model, you write your amounts, frequency and amounts of total treatment time on the IEP in quarterly, semester, or annual amounts in a way that gives you a little wiggle room. And it also results in a typical schedule being run 3 weeks out of the month, and then the 4th week being used for all of these additional activities. So that wouldn't require more staffing, but it would allow for the practitioners to have time to do the collaboration, the IEP meetings, the AAC programming, the observation, and all the things that we've spoken about. So, to answer your question a little more succinctly, it can result in increased staffing, but it also there are other ways to respond to a workload study that doesn't necessarily require additional staffing.
I'd like to just speak to the question about the added time burden with having students. And one of our attendees, Jean Policino, posted an article reference for people. And then there were a couple other comments that it really did not impact people taking students. So, and I know it has not in our district as well. So, and I see another comment from Jean, and thank you, that she's saying the most difficult period for staffing is during the transition from caseload to workload. We did find, when we started this work, exactly what Jean said, that it's a hard sell, and that's why you need to have the data to support the sell. And doing the time study and looking at how people are spending their time, or whether or not they're spending time outside of work hours on what tasks, is really, really important for you to gather and then to be able to share with administrators or whoever who you're reporting to directly. So again, those are the links to the article, which is downloadable and that you can share and read and with your colleagues and with your administrators. So we sort of like to close, so we have some more time for questions, but coming together is a beginning. Sandy, in the very beginning of our webinar, talked about the collaborative effort. Certainly the IDEA partnership is a great example of this. We came together because of the IDEA partnership. We had similar issues and knew that more voices were much more powerful. We are delighted to share this webinar with you, and we are delighted to share that article with you and for you to share it with as many people as you'd like. Keeping it together is a process, or keeping together is a process. Don't get discouraged if you do collect information and you don't catch the ear of someone a little bit above you. Keep collecting. Keep getting that data together, keep analyzing it, and keep coming back. Get yourself smarter and smarter and smarter on the whole process. And then keep working together because it will lead to success. Jody and I did not wake up one day, decide to do this, and convince our administrators. This has been a process that's been more than 10 years in the making. But it has worked for us. It has worked well for us. We are fortunate that we had administrators or continue to have administrators that understand it and work with us and respect it and respect the roles that we bring. And the importance of having ethical practices and the opportunity to spend the time with a student in a way that's really going to make a difference, and time to spend with teachers and other colleagues in school buildings in order to make a difference in their school climate and in the outcomes of their students. So can you convene your stakeholders in your local community to discuss this issue and share ideas for a positive change? We're very, very hopeful that you will. We'd like to kind of open it up. We've got questions coming in. We've got, we have a comment on the 3-to-1 model, and I don't know if Deb Dixon, our SLP colleague, would like to speak to that. Well, go ahead and answer some questions.
All right, the 3-1 comment was that it seemed somewhat artificial because it is true, you have to hold off on some activities till that 4th week of the month. We have found, though, that it does increase satisfaction and job retention, and it's better than a caseload model. Is it perfect? Well, I don't know if there is a perfect system out there considering the financial and other restraints that we all have to work under, but it is an alternative that many have found very productive. I just want to, there was some comments here about the challenges of the workload study and those kinds of things. The one thing that is important to include in that workload study that we haven't spoken about is the amount of churn that you anticipate on a caseload in any year. We all know that the students that are sitting in front of you or on your roster in September are not the same students that you see in January or in June. So to look at the history of that building or that school district's churn, so to speak, to determine are you losing the same number of students that you're gaining every year, or as you do that workload study, do you need to plan for, well, I know that there will be increased number of students who will need to be evaluated and who probably will be candidates. So put that kind of estimate in a workload analysis is also important to give you time to add students.
And what we found is that there's a range of workload percentages at which people are comfortable. If we try to start them at the lower end of that range at the start of the school year, knowing that those numbers are probably only going to go up from there, they can typically stay comfortable that way. But it does go up and down, and it also lets us know when maybe we need to send another person in to give them a hand. So if someone's numbers go down in one part of the district while someone else's numbers are going up, we can easily recognize that and then make adjustments accordingly.
The other thing that you can do is you can use a similar concept to just even look right at a building. I mean, we all know that we have buildings in our district that kind of can be a little bit of a problem, where a lot of referrals come in and those kinds of things. And so you can estimate the kinds of services that are going to be required in a particular building, which is what our North Carolina colleagues did with their formula. You can create sort of an estimate and get a sense of how much time is it going to take for that building and then kind of work around that. I'd like to just add one more thing to what Jody said. For those of you who are PTs, they are just completing the PT count study, and I don't know if there's anyone on the line here who participated in that. But what they did find, again, to just reiterate what Jody did say and with some of the research we found, it was about 50% in student services when you looked at services to and on behalf of children. Every district is different. Some districts are a little heavier on consultation. Absolutely appropriate. There's evidence to support that being a great practice model for some of our students. Again, the challenge with that is the IEP capture, because most often consultation is one of those nebulous things that you know you have to do it, but you never quite know how much time you're going to spend doing it. And so being able to look at your trend over time sort of helps to answer a couple of questions. How much time does it really take in the grand scheme of a week? And is it changing over time? I see Abigail's just asked the question about difficulty working within inclusion. And I think I just sort of spoke a little bit to that. I think we all know that to keep kids in their neighborhood schools really requires more work, not less, a lot more consultation and collaboration, maybe not as much direct intervention, which is the one thing that an IEP makes sure that you capture, which always seems to be the hot button number in our district. But if you do the time study, it will at least give you some information about how much time it's really taking. And then you can look at your practice trends and see how it changes. And that might be helpful to you, Abigail. I hope that comment works.
I see that Erin, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to cover, this is Deborah Crandall, and I want to continue with the question line regarding the work time study, because I think we need to delve into a couple factors as to how you can sell your administrators on the idea of beginning to collect the data. But before I do that, I do want to cover a couple of things that came up along the chat just to reemphasize the availability of the resources as well as the webinar itself. I think that we may have gotten the correct North Carolina link. If it is not posted in the chat box, we will certainly have that posted on the IDEA partnership website. We want to again thank the IDEA partnership for hosting this important webinar. Obviously, there's strong interest in it. We were only able to accommodate a little over 100 people this time, but we're really excited to know that many more we're trying to get on the line. And we do plan to have a part 2, a repeat IDEA workload approach webinar, hopefully sometime in February. We will also have this webinar available as a recording in approximately 1 week, and it will be on the IDEA partnership website as well as hopefully posted on AOTA, APTA, and ASHA's website as well. And as far as getting copies of the PowerPoint presentation, which are effective for beginning discussions at the local level, again, it's available by pressing on the file box above the chat box. And additionally, each of our association websites will also post that PowerPoint that can be accessible to members as well. So let's go back and continue some of the important questions that have been coming in. One thing I did want to ask the panelists about again is, selling the idea of number one, collecting the data to the administrators, because that's step one. How do you get that kind of support? And do you have any recommendations? Because obviously decisions are so data driven but monetarily driven too. So how can the majority of our listeners seem to be SIS personnel? So what kind of positive selling points can you give them in terms of that? I think the first step is always relationship building and trust building. That most of us and all of us should have that ongoing relationship with our building administrator where we're speaking to them on a regular basis, whether it's before school in the morning or at the end of the day, talking with them about our concerns, but also our success stories and our need to and desire to be very successful with all the students that we work with. So that provides a really good foundation. And then to express your concerns about your ability to deliver the full range and appropriate services to students under the current conditions, and that you would just like to engage in a study to determine how much time you're spending on all the different aspects of work, of roles and responsibilities that we have in supporting students. I think that's a really good starting point, and then being very legitimate in how you record that information. I know we tried to do this at one point and gave it up and came back to it another time because it is time consuming. And we felt, I'm not doing this accurately, so I want to do it, and we devised another system where we really could be much more accurate. because the statistics will be very fundamental to all that you're asking. So I think, number one, the relationship building, providing the rationale for why, and it's not because you don't want to work as hard, but you want to do better services, deliver better services to students, and have time to do the full continuum of services.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with what Deb said, relationship building and, getting the right people at the table to have the conversation. I think that one of the disadvantages of being a licensed personnel working in an educational setting is that people don't understand the implication of licensure and what that means to those of us who have them and how hard we work to protect them and do the right thing by them. And our professional organizations, their codes of ethics. And one of the things that bothered Jody and I initially when we were looking at counting heads was we knew or we suspected that people were having to sort of shortchange things here and there, and it's an ethical dilemma for professionals. And so getting the right people at the table, sharing your concerns from an ethical perspective, I think is important. Being able to speak about your licensure is important, and then convincing your colleagues that it's going to take a little work to get to a point where we've got things to share and that maybe we'd be in a position to move the whole workload concept forward. We're doing this in our early intervention program now because we've had some concerns there, and I'll leave this comment with you like I left with them. It is work. I can't promise that it will change anything, but I can promise you that if we don't do it, it won't change anything at all. And so that's kind of why we're setting out on this journey in our early intervention program to just take a look at our practice trends as we've moved over time to the primary service provider model.
And I think in addition to that is going to your administrator to have these discussions with the other service providers, as we did too. ASHA has created workload stuff as all the other organizations here, but it's when we come together and approach it jointly that the impact is greater. So grab your counselor, grab your OT, your PT, your school psychologist, other people that are concerned about their workload and ability to do their job effectively. First, have some internal meetings with that group to discover what should our ask be. Is it the data collection point? Is it something else? Come together, get agreement, and then invite yourselves into a conversation with an administrator and make it a very dedicated time. These kind of conversations shouldn't be held in the hallway or as you're running around the building. Make an appointment to talk with the administrator or invite the administrator and the director of special education to jointly meet and discuss this. And just think about any of the other stakeholders that may be impacted. Certainly as you go down the road and can roll out a workload, parents need to be engaged in some way, as well as the classroom teachers and other people.
Okay, we have one question. I think we have enough time for one more question and then a parting comment.
There's one question I'd like to answer. I saw a couple of people. Aaron O'Neill was one of the people who asked about a specific workload formula. I wish there was a magic formula that we could share with everyone. Unfortunately, there's not because they're very district specific. In order to come up with your workload formula, you're going to have to collect the data by doing a time study because the issues in my district will be different from the issues in your district. And the only way to find out what your formula is going to be is by tracking that time, doing a time study, and then analyzing what your workload is.
I'd like to remind everybody that if, as they leave this webinar, I know that more questions will come up. You can send additional questions to, we're using this as a clearinghouse for all of your questions, schools@asha.org. That's the little @ schools@asha.org. It's also in the chat box for you. And I think we have just a couple more seconds to, if I could just go around the table to our three panelists that are left to get any parting words from each of you. Deborah Dixon, you first.
Well, I guess first of all, I want to say thank you to all of you that are interested in this topic. Obviously, there's some enthusiasm about this, and I applaud you for wanting to increase your opportunity and ability to provide high-quality services to students. And we think this is a really fundamental aspect of doing that. So we hope that to provide some ongoing activities, to repeat this and perhaps to do some more work on this, and certainly would invite you to engage in conversations with the connections that we've made today.
Right.
Sue?
I guess my closing comment would be advocate for yourself. It's your practice in your state and your district. You know, arm yourself with the appropriate information, get the right people at the table. You can do it, and we're here to help.
Jody?
I think that we're all bound by the common interest in doing what's best for children, and this is the best way that we can do it. I think joining forces with our colleagues who have similar interests and similar issues that they're dealing with in regard to caseload is the best way to do it. We can speak in a unified voice. What was said here earlier was that we're small groups individually, but when we join together, we're much more likely to be heard. So talk to your colleagues, continue to do your good work, and we're here to help you if you need us, anything we can do.
Again, many, many thanks to the IDEA partnership and Sandy Shifkin for hosting the webinar, and we look forward to working with all of you in this evolving and important project.